Welcome to the Gilbert House Fellowship, a virtual gathering of believers seeking to better understand the Word of God, with your hosts, Derek and Sharon Gilbert, and Sam T. Doxson.
So this morning we give kind of an overview of the book, The Great Inception, and we got some at the back table. By the way, brought a stack of magazines, Skywatch TV magazine. Those are free. Help yourself to those. If you don't take them, I have to carry them back home. So this afternoon, want to look at one group of folks that were in the land of Canaan that had to get pushed out. These were people that God had marked for, well, frankly, for destruction because of their worship of the small g gods. And I'm going to have to work off an outline that was intended for a time about twice as long as what we have here. So we'll find out if my dad was right when he said, never ask Derek for the time because he tells you how to build a watch. We'll see if I can be succinct here. Again, the Genesis 6 worldview we talked about this morning, the Bible means what it says when the sons of God, angelic beings called the Watchers, descended upon Mount Hermon. They found that the daughters of men were fair and chose wives that produced the Nephilim. Those were the giants, the men of renown who lived before the flood. The flood was sent to purge the earth of its wickedness, which included not just the fact that these giants were on the earth, but the spiritual wickedness that these watchers brought to mankind. Forbidden knowledge, sorcery, witchcraft, potions, fortune-telling, divining the future by looking at the stars, things like that. We weren't supposed to know. That is actually part of the mission of Jesus Christ. And our friend Dr. Michael S. Heiser has an excellent book, also published by our publisher, Defender Publishing, called Reversing Hermon. If you want to find out how the Genesis 6 incident impacted the mission of Jesus, Reversing Hermon is a book you should have in your library. After the flood, those rebellious watchers who created the Nephilim confined in Tartarus, which is a level below Hades. It's like a special place of confinement. This is mentioned by Peter in 2 Peter 2:4. The Greeks also knew about the rebellious watchers, except they called them Titans, the old gods, headed up by Cronus. But the one big difference is that while both the pagan nations and the Jews of Jesus' day, and in fact the early church fathers until about the time of Augustine, understood that the origin of demons were the spirits of these Nephilim, the pagans believed those spirits were good. They're helpful. Whereas, of course, Christians and Jews understood, no, they are a plague upon mankind. And considering that Jesus did battle against these demons, a big part of his ministry was casting demons out, right? That was not just bringing deliverance to people who were being oppressed and possessed. It was Jesus walking around the land of Israel and saying, this is my property. Get off my land. The holy mountain, that's what this whole war is about. The first holy mountain was Eden. The last one is Zion. And that's where the Battle of Armageddon will be fought. After the Tower of Babel incident, God said, okay, you people don't want to serve me. I'm going to essentially disown you. I will give you to these small g gods, the sons of God, the B'nai Elohim, as their inheritance. How many were there? 70. 70 nations in the table of nations, Genesis 10. This is according to Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 and 9. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. And there's a tradition among the Canaanites and the Egyptians that the high God had 70 sons. That's not a coincidence. It's just they got the story from the enemy's public relations office. Deuteronomy 32:9, though, this is the key verse. But the Lord's portion, Yahweh's portion, is his people, Jacob, his allotted inheritance, Israel, his heritage, his people, his land. And we see the Old Testament as a record, essentially, of these 70 nations ruled by these pagan gods against Israel. That's why they wanted to destroy the bloodline from which the Messiah would come. And they continually made inroads to encroach on Israel. That's what the battle on Mount Carmel was about. And that's why Jesus, when he came down from Mount Hermon, I didn't even mention this in the early, I forgot this part. Mount Hermon Not only were the Watchers began their rebellion, but it was known to the ancient world as the secret dwelling of the Anunnaki, the gods of Sumer. It was believed by the Canaanites to be the place where El, their creator god, lived with his 70 sons. But Mount Hermon in the New Testament was the site of the Transfiguration. Jesus chose that mountain. The Bible tells us a very high mountain in the vicinity of Caesarea Philippi. The only mountain around Caesarea Philippi that fits that description is Mount Hermon. And Jesus went up that mountain and was transfigured into a being of light. That was our God sending a flare into the spirit realm saying, "Here I am, come get some." And then when he came down the mountain, Luke chapter 10, he sent disciples out ahead of him into Galilee. How many? 70. Coincidence? No! This was him saying, "Get off my land." So this is the battle that continues to this day. But maybe I've attended the wrong churches, but I've never really heard it described in these terms before. So forgive me if I get a little passionate about this, because when I discover something new, I'm like, "Sharon, did you know?" And she'll say, "Did you not listen to my presentation in Chicago 3 years ago?" Oops. So the sons of God that God placed over the nations, these 70, God basically set themselves up as gods in their own right. And of course, God then passed judgment on them because they were not ruling fairly. This is Psalm 82, which is where you get the clearest picture of this God versus the gods paradigm, where God takes his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? And skipping to verse 6 of Psalm 82. I said, this is God speaking, "You are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like any prince." These small g gods know that their day is coming. Their end has already been decreed. They just want to take as many of us with them as they can when they go. Now, most scholars, most commentators, most Bible teachers would not agree with that interpretation of Psalm 82. They would argue that Psalm 82 is God condemning the rulers of the Israelites, the judges of the Israelites. Frankly, with all due respect, because I'm not a credentialed scholar, that doesn't make any sense. If you're talking to a human judge who's ruling unjustly, why would you say, "Like men you shall die"? Like, duh. No. When God says, "You are gods, you are Elohim," everywhere in the Hebrew Bible, where the Hebrews use the word Elohim, they mean a spirit being, not a human. So, but of course these human, or rather inhuman entities have always found willing human accomplices. And there's one group of people in particular that we'll focus on, and they're called the Amorites. The Amorites were one of the 7 nations that were in the land of Canaan when Joshua brought the Hebrews across the Jordan River. Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, a bunch of other ites. But the Amorites in particular deserve attention because God called them out specifically in Genesis 15, where he makes the covenant with Abraham. He says to Abraham, "Your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. And then skipping down to verse 16, Genesis 15:16, "They shall come back here," meaning the land of Canaan, "in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." The sin of the Amorites. And as I was researching the book, I began to wonder, well, what the heck did that mean? What was so bad about the Amorites? Well, as I started reading, and Sharon can tell you, for me, a fun evening is finding a new academic paper to read through. I am so boring. There is a whole subculture among historians and archaeologists dealing with the Amorites because they are fascinating. There was a period about 500 years that scholars call the age of the Amorites, because for about 500 years, from the time of Abraham until about the time of the Exodus, or just about, they controlled the entire ancient Near East. If you're looking at a map of the Middle East today, everything from southeast Iraq and Kuwait around to northern Syria, southern Turkey, western Iran, down into the Levant, which is Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, even northern Egypt. the Amorites controlled all of that. All of it. Various Amorite kingdoms and tribes, they controlled it all. The evil of the Amorites was legendary. 1 Kings 21. We know how bad a guy Ahab was, right? Married Jezebel. Actually, it was Mr. Jezebel. She wore the pants in that family. There was none who sold himself to do what was evil in the sight of the Lord, like Ahab, whom Jezebel, his wife, incited. He acted very abominably in going after idols, as the Amorites had done before. God compared Ahab to the Amorites. They were like a yardstick against which you measured wickedness. 2 Kings 21. Manasseh, the king of Judah, who burned his children as a sacrifice to the god Molech. 2 Kings 21:10, because Manasseh, king of Judah, has committed these abominations and has done things more evil than all that the Amorites did. Well, finally, we found somebody who was even worse than the Amorites. But again, God was comparing these wicked kings of Israel and Judah to the Amorites. And because Manasseh was so bad, that was what brought the Babylonians in to destroy Jerusalem, destroy the temple. Which is ironic because the Amorites founded the kingdom of Babylon. Now, Babylon is legendary for its wickedness. I mean, Babylon to this day is a symbol of spiritual wickedness, right? I mean, it's a symbol of an occult system so evil that the end times one world occult church is called Babylon the Great. The thing is, there is no such ethnicity as Babylonian. No such ethnicity. It would be like calling me a Chicagoite because I was born there. The Babylonians were actually Amorites. The kingdom of Babylon was founded when a tribal chieftain by the name of Sumu Abum rose to power in the year 1894 BC when he conquered the neighboring village. That was the origin of the kingdom of Babylon. An Amorite chieftain took over the neighboring village. This is how unimportant the village of Babylon was. The first 5 kings of Babylon didn't even call themselves king of Babylon. It wasn't until Hammurabi the Great, around 1750 BC. So, who were the Amorites? What is their history? They first show up in history around 2500 BC. A city that is in northern Syria today, the city's been destroyed, but it would have been in what is now northern Syria, called Ebla. They are believed to come from a mountain called Jebel Bishri. Jebel Bishri. This is a low mountain range that is just west of the Euphrates River in what is now eastern Syria today. Perhaps, not coincidentally, possibly, this is the core of the territory controlled by the Islamic State today. They also came from an area northeast of Baghdad. Of course, Baghdad wasn't a city back then, but the area northeast of Baghdad, there's a river called the Diyala River and some mountains up that way. There's another area there where the Amorites were known to have lived in this ancient period. We're talking now 2500, 2400 BC. Okay? This is about 400 or 500 years before Abraham. They were known as shepherds, nomads. They traveled around with their flocks, kind of like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Very similar lifestyle. They kept on the move so they could pasture their flocks. They had a tribal structure like the Israelites, very similar in that respect as well. They had 2 main tribal divisions, one called the Benu Simal. Benu Simal, that means sons of the left hand. Why? Because when you face the rising sun, left hand is north. Essentially, this means northerners. The other tribal division was called the Benu Yamina. Benu Yamina, sons of the right hand, southerners. But interestingly, when you transliterate from Semitic languages into English, the Y becomes a J, and so Benu Yamina becomes Benjamin. That's not the same Benjamin that was the son of Jacob, just letting you know that that was a name, that was popular back 4,000 years ago. They had a reputation of being really vicious, very, very tough. They were mercenaries. Kingdoms from what is now Syria all the way down to ancient Sumer, which is southeastern Iraq, would hire these guys out as mercenaries. These were tough dudes. And they weren't always loyal. Sometimes they would serve the king, sometimes they would kill the king. Depend on what they thought was a better deal. They were so frightening that the last Sumerian kings of Mesopotamia. This is called the third dynasty of Ur, city Ur, U-R, built a wall 175 miles long. This wall stretched from the Euphrates River across the Tigris River and over to this river called the Diyala that runs northeast out of Baghdad. This is in like 2100 BC. That's a lot of mud bricks. It's a lot of stone. And they built it to keep out one of these tribes of the Amorites, this particular tribe of Amorites called the Tidnum. How do we know that the Tidnum were the reason they built the wall? Because the Sumerians literally named the wall the Amorite wall that keeps the Tidnum away. Seriously. But at the same time this wall was being built, some of the kingdoms in what is now western Syria built a wall that modern scholars have also given a very creative name. In French, it's un très long mur, which is, in English, a very long wall. This wall is 135 miles long. And it's shaped in an arc east of the contemporary city of Homs, Syria. Homs. Now, this wall was only about 4 feet high and about 3 feet thick, so it may not have been a defensive wall, but it seems to have separated the areas where farmers lived and the areas where the shepherds, the Amorites, lived. And maybe it was defensive, because getting cattle across a 4-foot-high wall is a little bit of a chore. But it's significant that this wall was being built at the same time as the wall that keeps the Tidnum away, and a wall in Egypt called the Walls of the Ruler. Again, right around the same period of time, between 2100 and 2000 BC, it was finished in the Egyptian wall at about 1960 BC. It connected the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. Again, a long wall. The waterway, basically, was one wall, and then a canal in the middle, and then another wall. And the canal was 230 feet wide. Why? Because they wanted to keep the shepherds, what they called the Asiatics, out of Egypt. And this was at the same time the Sumerians were trying to keep them out of ancient Sumer, and the people who lived along the western side of Syria, where it rained enough that they could farm, they wanted to keep the shepherd Amorites away. Point being, these Amorites were tough dudes. Nobody wanted them for neighbors. But in all three cases, the walls didn't work. The Amorites took over southeast Iraq, Sumer, founded the kingdom of Babylon, which basically dominated all of Mesopotamia. They took over northern Egypt just before the house of Israel went looking for food there. Coincidence? I'm not a coincidence theorist. Also, western Syria. Basically, as I said, by the year 1900 BC, the Amorites had taken over every kingdom in that entire region. Essentially, it was the entire known civilized world at that point in history was controlled by Amorite kingdoms. What happened to the Amorites through history, very briefly, they became the Canaanites. They became the Phoenicians, the kingdoms of Sidon and Tyre, which produced Jezebel, which produced the greatest maritime trading empire of the ancient world. The Phoenicians were renowned as sailors. In fact, there's some evidence that the reason that the Amorites wound up in Egypt in the first place was because the Egyptians didn't know how to build boats for the Mediterranean. They were great going up and down the Nile, but when it came to getting out on the sea, they needed real sailors, and so they brought the Amorites, the Canaanites in, and then they took over. The Arameans. David had a couple of battles with the Arameans, but they really had trouble with the northern kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Aram Damascus. Those were descended from the Amorites. The Chaldeans were probably descended from an Amorite tribe. The Chaldeans founded the Neo-Babylonian Empire. That's the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar. All of these came from the Amorites. The Amorites who were descended from Ham, the son of Noah. Now, who did these Amorites worship? We're dealing in a supernatural war here, so it's kind of important to know. Who did these people venerate? Who are their gods? And there were several. They had an elder god, And they worshiped different gods depending on where they were in the land. The elder gods for the Sumerians, the ones who moved into the territory that used to be controlled by the Sumerians. The chief god was called Enlil. He was the father of the gods. Interestingly, Enlil is the root word of the term used for the generic word God by the Akkadians who kind of succeeded the Sumerians. Enlil was sort of transliterated to Elil and then became the word Ilu. Ilu just simply means small g, God, Ilu. We'll fast forward a couple thousand years and you'll see why that's important. In western Mesopotamia, the land of Canaan, the land of what today would be Syria or Lebanon, the chief god was called El instead of Enlil. And there are some scholars who believe that El is actually the root word from which the generic term God came. In fact, in the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the word El, Elohim, is a generic term for small g, God. It can also mean God, capital G, God, Yahweh, which is why some scholars believe that we foolish Christians don't realize we're actually worshiping the chief god of the Canaanites. You can't fix somebody who's got blinders on and refuses to see the truth. That's all I'll say about that. El was a little different from Enlil. Enlil was the chief god of the Sumerians who wanted to kill all of humanity because we were keeping him awake all night. And he sent this massive flood, except Enki, the god of the abyss, saved us by warning their version of Noah. El, the chief god, the creator god of the Canaanite pantheon, was a little different. He is what you would best call semi-retired. And again, scholars think that Yahweh is El. Again, these are secular researcher scholars who just say, well, the names are the same, must be the same God. But Yahweh and El are depicted very, very differently. I mean, our God, Yahweh, is an active God. He is a God who didn't just set the world in motion and step back to watch it all. He still participates. He is the triune God. He is a God made flesh in the form of Jesus Christ, who willingly gave up his life that we might live. El, on the other hand, just kind of sat up there on Mount Hermon with his pantheon, and there are myths about El who, invites a bunch of gods over to his house and gets so stinking drunk that he winds up wallowing in his own filth. That's not Yahweh. There's another myth about El, where he is visited by some sort of monstrous demonic creature with horns on his head and is so scared that he basically collapses and messes himself. That's not Yahweh. That's who the Canaanites considered the creator of their pantheon. And scholars somehow read into that the Hebrews just copied their religion from the Canaanites and the Mesopotamians. The chief god of the one who wanted to kill the world because we were too noisy, and the other who was such a chicken that he wound up wallowing in his own filth because he was confronted by something scary. Anyway, those are the elder gods of the Amorites. Now, in a lot of the pantheon, a lot of the cosmology of the ancient world, the elder gods were replaced by a younger generation of gods. In Sumer, again, this is Iraq, southeastern Iraq, Kuwait. These younger gods included the moon god. The moon god is a very important figure in world history, more important than we've been taught, I think. The Sumerian name for this moon god was Nana. The Akkadian name for this god was Sin, spelled S-I-N, but it's got a little circumflex over the I. Sin. To the Amorites, it was Yarik. Interestingly, when you transliterate again from a Semitic language to English, the Y becomes a J. So Yarik becomes Jerik. Oh, and Jericho was a city of the moon god. We'll talk about that in just a minute and why that's interesting. The centers of moon god worship included the Ur in southeastern Iraq. This is where the great ziggurat of Ur was discovered. Saddam Hussein was rebuilding this. So you can find pictures of this on the internet today as to what it probably looked like back 4,000 years ago. The restoration was never completed because we invaded in 2003 and that kind of put a stop to things. But you can find, U.S. soldiers who were part of Desert Storm who got a chance to see that site with their own eyes. And it's got to be spectacular. I just remind you, though, if you weren't here this morning, that as spectacular as that temple to the moon god is or was, it's still smaller and not as old as the temple to Enki, god of the abyss, at the city of Eridu. Another important city of the moon god cult was Haran. This is the Haran that Abraham came from. This is in northern Mesopotamia. It's actually in what is today Turkey. That was a key center. In fact, the Amorites venerated that god, the moon god, so much that when these various tribes had a treaty, hey, let's all get together and attack these other guys because we hate them, they would go there to the temple of the moon god in Haran, and then they would sacrifice a donkey. Why? I don't know. That was their thing. Then Jericho, of course, which, interestingly, was also the name of one of the tribes of the Amorites. There was a tribe called the Yariku, named for the moon god. Symbols of the moon god worship: the crescent, because, of course, the crescent moon represented the heavenly boat in which the moon god sailed across the night sky, but also the bull. The bull was a symbol of the moon god, partly because of the fertility aspect. If you've got a bull and you've got female, cows, yeah, that's money, right? But the horns also represent the symbol. And over time, that symbol, the bull, was equated also with the symbology of the storm god, Hadad, Baal, to the point where during the time of David and after the divided kingdom, you can find that there are symbols of the bull representing both the moon god and the storm god at the same time. In the Sumerian period, Sin was considered the son of Enlil. That was their chief Sumerian high god. Sin was the father of the sun god. Now, I'd always heard that the sun god was the key god, that Nimrod was a representation of the sun god, or Baal was the sun god. That happens not to be the case. The sun god was actually junior in the pantheon to the moon god. The moon god was more important. And maybe it's because when you're in a desert where it reaches 120 degrees in the shade, the sun god is just something you try to survive, whereas the moon god actually guides your planting cycles and your harvest cycles and when you travel to do pasture land and so forth. The moon god was more important. In fact, there's a new text that was just published by a scholar within the last 2 months that showed from the ancient Babylonian period that the moon god was actually the chief god of the pantheon, the king of the divine assembly, which again runs kind of against what I had been taught, what I had read and what I had heard. The moon god was actually more important in the ancient world during the biblical period than the sun god, and at least in part of ancient Mesopotamia, even more important than the storm god. Now, Marduk was elevated to the position of chief god of the pantheon in Babylon. Marduk was the city god of Babylon. And again, as Babylon started out as this unimportant, rinky-dink little village, Marduk was not very important among the gods. If you were ranking like the AP poll of the top 20 gods, Marduk was way down the list. But as Babylon became more important, as it became more powerful, its military conquered more cities nearby, Marduk became more important. But the kings of Babylon, the guys who founded Babylon, considered the moon god the god that they worshipped. Okay, yeah, Marduk's the city god, but Sin, the moon god, that's the one that guides my destiny. In fact, Hammurabi the Great, the guy who wrote that famous law code that we all had to learn about in high school, the introduction and the conclusion of his famous law code gives thanks to Sin, the moon god, for establishing his dynasty, for establishing his household. The importance of the moon god, something I cannot overstress. Now, there is one other, I should mention the storm god as well. Hadad, we talked about this morning. The storm god was more important in western Syria and northern Mesopotamia because once you got out of the desert areas of Iraq, rainfall becomes a little more important. You can actually grow things without having to dig canals to bring water from the Tigris and Euphrates. So the storm god was kind of the preeminent god in what is today Syria, Lebanon, and northern Israel. And that's why there were so many references to Baal in the Bible, because the storm god was so important to their next-door neighbors. But in both cases here, whether you've got the storm god or the moon god as taking over, you've got a younger god replacing an older god. And we see this in other pantheons as well, where Zeus takes over for Kronos in the Greek pantheon, Thor taking over for Odin in the Germanic religions. Same pattern, same story, different names, just repeated over and over, and it all traces back to ancient Sumer. It all started there. Same players, different names. Now, one other deity that we need to mention, and this is one that was worshipped all across the ancient world, and this was one I mentioned this morning, the goddess, the queen of heaven, known to the Sumerians as Inanna. To the Babylonians, she was Ishtar. Astarte to the Canaanites. The Greeks called her Aphrodite. Romans called her Venus. She was often in the cosmology or the iconography of the ancient world. Whenever they had a picture of their gods or their kings, they would show this astral triad, sun, moon, planet, Venus. Sun god, Shamash; moon god, Sin; Venus, Ishtar. The thing is, Inanna, you could make a really good case, is the god or the spirit of the age in which we live. And I won't be too graphic, but we're living in an age where men can call themselves women. In fact, men can win Women of the Year awards. We're seeing cases where young men are winning track meets and weightlifting competitions in girls' categories because they call themselves girls. And grown-ups who ought to know better are going along with it. And we're told that this is progressive. This is progressive thought. I'm here to tell you that this is regressive, because the goddess Inanna was promoting this lifestyle in 3000 BC. 1,000 years before Abraham, this lifestyle was considered normal. Her followers were often transgender, transvestite, eunuchs. There's a hymn to the goddess Inanna that dates from about 1900 BC. That'd be the time of Abraham, in which she is praised for turning the man into the woman, and turning the woman into the man, and turning the right side, male, into the left side, and the left side into the right side. This lifestyle was more than 1,000 years old when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the law. Think about that. What was happening 1,500 years ago? King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table? The fall of the Western Roman Empire? That's a long time ago. But that's how long Inanna, Ishtar, Aphrodite had been worshipped before Moses came down from Mount Sinai and said, no. Fornication is a sin. Anything outside of marriage, which, by the way, we shouldn't have to explain, is one man and one woman. Think about that. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai, that was progressive. And it still is. The people who are telling us that gender fluidity is progressive want to take us back to 1,000 years before Abraham. And they don't even realize it. Here's another thing. And I'm telling you how to build the watch here, so I'm looking at the clock and realizing I've got a long way to go on this. So I'm going to skip over some other things. But again, all of this stuff is in the book, and I've got a series of like 30 short videos, 5 to 8 minutes, that I've posted to the internet, where if you want to see this stuff in detail, you can do it from the comfort of your own home and, at my YouTube channel. This blew my mind because, again, this comes from research that is done by secular scholars, guys with no biblical dog in the hunt, as it were. The Amorites, who were the neighbors of the ancient Israelites, worshipped gods that they believed were their ancestors. I mean, it wasn't just that they were worshiping these small g false gods. They believed they were literally their ancestors. And I stumbled onto this with research that was done by a secular scholar, published in a secular journal. This is not a Bible scholar trying to make a case for Christ. One of the most important tribes of the Amorites I mentioned, the Tidnum. Also, it's spelled, in some cases, the Ditanu, depended on where they were mentioned and how it was spelled. The kings of Babylon, Hammurabi the Great and his ancestors. The kings of the old Assyrian Empire from the time of Abraham. the kings of a kingdom, a small kingdom on the Syrian coast of the Mediterranean called Ugarit, all trace their ancestry back to this tribe called the Datanu. And there are kings in these lineages who would use the name Datanu or Datana as what's called the theophoric element. Almost all of the names in this period of history, 4,000 years ago, had the name of a god in the name. You see it in the Bible too, like Samuel, Micah, Hezekiah. The Kaya part is a reference to Yahweh. But in the pagan world, the gods named were like Adad or Enlil or Sin or and so forth. But there were some of these Amorite kings, who named themselves like Sumu Datana, which shows that they believed that these were gods. These ancestral kings, they believed were gods. Now, at Ugarit, there was a tablet that was translated about 30 years ago. Again, this is a kingdom that was on the Mediterranean coast. The site was found about 1922, so I've only known about this for about 100 years. And about 30 years ago, they translated a tablet that the scholar who did the translation titled The Sacrifice of the Shades Liturgy. Sacrifice of the Shades Liturgy. And he renders it into English this way. And this was a liturgy to crown the new king of Ugarit, this new Amorite king. You are summoned, O Rephaim of the earth. Oh, Rephaim. Og, king of Bashan, was the last of the remnant of the Rephaim. So that means the Rephaim weren't just invented by the Hebrews. The Amorite neighbors knew about the Rephaim. Not only that, they were summoning them in this ritual. The next line, you are invoked, O counsel of the Datanu. The Datanu. Well, that's that ancient Amorite tribe that were the ancestors of the kings. Okay. Elkanu the Rapha is summoned. Taramano the Rapha is summoned. They're naming these entities. Sidanu and Radanu is summoned. Tharu the usurper is summoned. I'd like to know his story. The Rephaim of old are summoned. You are summoned, O Rephaim of the earth. You are invoked, O counsel of the Datanu. This is in this ritual. To welcome the last, it turned out to be the last king of Ugarit. The Rephaim didn't help him much. Their kingdom was destroyed within about 20 years. The ritual to crown this king begins with a summons of the spirits of these dead royal ancestors. Now, who are the Rephaim? In the Bible, they are mentioned, of course, Og, king of Bashan, the last remnant of the Rephaim. In Isaiah 14, which is that really interesting passage about how thou art fallen, Lucifer, son of the dawning. If you back up to verse 9 in that passage, we find that these shades, which is sometimes how the word Rephaim is translated in the Bible, greet this rebel who gets kicked off of God's holy mountain, Eden, out of the garden, to Sheol, which is the place of the dead in the Old Testament. And these shades, these Rephaim, greet him. Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. It rouses the shades, the Rapha, to greet you, all who were leaders of the earth, these ancient dead kings, Amorite kings. All of them will answer and say to you, you too have become as weak as we. You have become like us. Your pomp has brought you down to Sheol, the sound of your harps. Maggots are laid as a bed beneath you, and worms are your covers. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, Lucifer, son of the dawn. Now, here's the interesting thing. A secular scholar from Estonia by the name of Amar Anus says that the root word, in the Semitic root of the word Rephaim, is connected to a Greek phrase that the Greek poet Hesiod used to describe the demigods, the men of renown, the heroes of old who lived during the golden age ruled by Kronos. As I mentioned this morning, those demigods who lived during the golden age of Kronos would be the Nephilim from Genesis 6. So the Rephaim that these kings were summoning were the Nephilim, the spirits of the Nephilim. In other words, they were summoning demons to bless their king. And these are the people that the Amorites believed were their ancestors. But here's the thing. Datanu, the name of this Amorite tribe, from which the royal houses of Babylon and Assyria and Ugarit, these Amorite kings said that they descended, according to this scholar, is the root word of the Greek word Titan. The old gods of the Greek pantheon. Kronos, Atlas was a Titan. These Amorite kings were performing a necromancy ritual to summon the spirits of the old gods, the Titans, to bless the new incoming king. Whoa! Does the sin, the iniquity of the Amorites begin to make just a little more sense? These people were conducting these rituals to summon these spirits of these things, believing that they would infuse their kings with power. Like I said, didn't work. But fascinating stuff. I could go for another hour on this, but I won't, because you've been very gracious to listen to me go on about this. So I know I find this fascinating. I hope you find it interesting too, because it synchronizes with the Bible, and it makes it easier to understand when God declared that these people were karem, which is a Hebrew word that means devoted to destruction. You find that word a lot. In the book of Joshua, wherever you see in the book of Joshua that a city or a group of people were devoted to destruction, that comes from the Hebrew word karem. In fact, karem comes from the same root word as the name of Mount Hermon. The idea is this is so sacred that if you touch it, you die. Or, God says, if you touch it because it is cursed, you die. And so these people that God decreed karem had to be destroyed. Not just the people, but all of their livestock, all of their belongings, because they were totally sold out to these old gods. Call them Titans, call them Watchers, Refaim, Nephilim. The point is, the writers of the Bible didn't make up these people, these gods, these entities. Their neighbors knew about them. The Bible, in some cases, calls the Rephaim and the Nephilim their descendants. In the books of Joshua, Exodus, calls them the Anakim. There are Egyptian texts that mention the Anakim. History, archaeology, fits together with the biblical narrative and explains the history of the Bible. Makes it easier to understand why certain things happen in certain ways. The confrontation at the Red Sea. God didn't do it because he has a flair for special effects. He did it to demonstrate his power over what was supposed to be the home turf of Baal. The confrontation on Mount Carmel, where God consumed the sacrifice with the fire of Yahweh. It was because he wields the thunderbolt, not Baal, the storm god. Just like God is the cloud rider, not Baal. Jesus went up Mount Hermon for the transfiguration because his holy mountain, his mount of assembly, his mount of the congregation is the one that controls the universe. Not Mount Hermon, not Mount Zaphon, and certainly not Jabal al-Nur, where Muhammad was deceived by an entity that called itself Jibreel. There are plenty of other things in the Bible that we can talk about. Is it interesting that when the Israelites left Egypt on their way to Sinai, they crossed the wilderness of Sin? Or is it the wilderness of Sin, the moon god? Some scholars say, yeah, that's what it was called. Why? Because the shepherds who traveled in the desert basically did it at night when the moon god was out. Because when the sun god was out, you die. Og of Bashan. Here's another little tidbit. You ever wonder why Og of Bashan, in the book of Exodus, Moses, while describing the battles that they had against Og and Sihon, the king of Heshbon, the Amorite kings of the Trans-Jordan, lived east of the Jordan River, why Moses thought it was important to include the size of Og's bed? And why would he do that? 4 cubits by 9 cubits. That's 6 foot by 13 foot 6. Well, Og was a giant. Well, maybe. But not coincidentally, that also matches exactly the dimensions of the cultic bed of the god Marduk in his temple in Babylon, where once a year at their New Year festival, Marduk and his consort, Sarpanatu, would come down and have ritual lovemaking in the cult bed to bless the land. Moses was linking Og and his kingdom with the occult wickedness of Babylon, which was founded by Amorites. Og was an Amorite. There's more to it than just on a surface reading. And because we don't live in the 15th century BC, we don't understand the world the way Moses and the prophets did. Joshua, Jericho, city of the moon god. Since I mentioned this, I better leave you with this before we conclude. Joshua 5:10 tells us, while the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month in the evening on the plains of Jericho. The Passover is always in the month of Nisan. That's the first month of the year. The 14th of Nisan, and in the Jewish calendar, the first of the month is always on the new moon. That's when the moon is dark. So the 15th of the month, full moon, right? Well, every year at that New Year's festival, where Marduk and his consort would come down and have their fling, this was going on all over Mesopotamia. This was called the Akitu ritual, the Akitu festival. And it actually originated in Ur to celebrate the moon god. So here at Jericho, the city of the moon god, first full moon of the new year. This Akitu festival was a 12-day festival. And during this festival, the god moved outside the city temporarily into a little shack called the Akitu house, and the people of the city would have to go through these long rituals and parties, and they would walk around the fields that they wanted blessed in a circle, and walk around the city, and then on the 12th day, the god would come back into the city, and they'd be ready for a new year. So just after that festival, where the moon god came back in the city, suddenly the first full moon, when the moon is at the height of his power, this is why God put the date in the book of Joshua. On the 15th, the Israelites begin walking around the city of Jericho, mocking their ritual to show them again, Yahweh, the God of Israel, He is God. And this happens over and over in the Bible. History, archaeology is awesome. But our God is even more awesome. Like I said, I could go on and on about this because I just find this fascinating, but I've been up here an hour, and I thank you for your time and your attention. Our God is incredible. Our good friend, Dr. Michael Heiser, has said something that I think is just profound. It's funny, but it's profound. If it's in the Bible and it's weird, it's important. The things in the Bible that we think are throwaway details, like, oh yeah, on the 14th of the month, that's when we celebrated the Passover. And then the next day we started marching. Why is that detail in there? God told Moses to turn around and camp here in front of Baal Zephon and face this place until... Why is that in there? There are reasons. There are reasons. And it's to show that God that we serve, the one true God, the Creator, He holds the power. And as it says in Psalm 82, a day is coming when those gods will die like men and fall like any prince. And I echo the words of the psalmist Asaph. Rise, Lord, and judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. Come quickly, Lord Jesus. Amen.
Thank you for joining us. We post a new Bible study each Sunday morning. Join the discussion at the Gilbert House Fellowship page on Facebook. Subscribe to our podcast feed and explore the archives online at gilberthouse.org.
Troublesome times are here, filling men's hearts with